In April 1534, Jacques Cartier set sail from Saint-Malo with 2 ships and 60 sailors, carrying orders from King Francis I that would reshape the world, find gold, discover a passage to Asia, and extend France's influence across the Atlantic. What Cartier discovered would prove far more valuable than Spanish treasure. When Cartier encountered over 300 indigenous people at Gaspé Bay, he made a revolutionary decision that would define French colonialism for centuries. Unlike Spanish conquistadors, who arrived with overwhelming military force, systematically enslaving and slaughtering entire populations in their quest for gold, the French took a radically different approach to New World colonization. Cartier returned to France not with indigenous captives bound in chains, but with 2 sons of Chief Donnacona as honored guests who would learn French language and customs, serving as cultural bridges for future expeditions. This practice of cultural exchange, while still problematic by modern standards, contrasted sharply with the immediately aggressive approaches employed by Spanish conquistadors throughout the Americas. This first diplomatic meeting established a revolutionary pattern that would distinguish French empire building from all other European powers. While Spain focused obsessively on extracting precious metals through brutal conquest and forced labor systems that decimated indigenous populations, France gradually centered its North American interests on something far more sustainable: the lucrative fur trade. Beaver pelts became extraordinarily valuable commodities in European markets, where skilled craftsmen fashioned them into fashionable hats, highly prized by the continental elite. European fashion trends created seemingly insatiable demand for high-quality furs, making these pelts more valuable than many precious metals and creating powerful economic incentives for peaceful trade relationships rather than costly military conquest. This economic foundation shaped France's entire colonial philosophy. Rather than establishing large settler colonies requiring vast agricultural lands and systematic displacement of indigenous peoples, the French built intricate trading networks that actually depended on native hunters, trappers, and guides who possessed irreplaceable knowledge of local conditions and seasonal patterns. Independent French traders, known as coureurs de bois, literally runners of the woods, ventured deep into the continent's interior, often adopting indigenous ways of life, learning native languages, and forming lasting alliances through strategic intermarriage. These relationships eventually gave rise to the distinct Métis culture that successfully bridged European and indigenous worlds. However, early French ambitions faced devastating setbacks. A Huguenot attempt to establish Fort Caroline in Florida ended in disaster when Spanish forces massacred nearly all colonists. More critically, religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots consumed France throughout the late 16th century, draining resources that might have supported colonial expansion. Despite these challenges, French engagement continued through seasonal fishing settlements in Newfoundland and trading posts along the St. Lawrence River. These modest beginnings secured crucial footholds for future expansion. The 17th century marked France's transformation from tentative explorer to serious colonial power. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City, establishing the heart of New France and the launching point for continental expansion. Champlain understood that survival in harsh North American conditions required genuine cooperation with indigenous peoples, rather than their subjugation, a lesson many European colonizers fatally ignored. What emerged was a uniquely French approach to colonization centered on the North American beaver. European fashion had created insatiable demand for beaver felt hats among the wealthy elite, making these pelts extraordinarily valuable commodities. A single high-quality beaver pelt could fetch more than a month's wages for a French laborer, creating powerful incentives for wilderness exploration and peaceful trade relationships. With severely limited military resources and far fewer potential settlers than their rapidly expanding British competitors, French colonial authorities made the strategic decision to cultivate carefully managed alliances with powerful indigenous confederations, particularly the sophisticated Haudenosaunee League and other major tribal nations. These complex partnerships were reinforced through elaborate trade networks, ceremonial diplomatic meetings, and strategic intermarriage between French traders and indigenous women. Most remarkable were the legendary coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, who ventured far beyond French settlements to live among indigenous peoples for months or years. These extraordinary traders became essential cultural intermediaries, learning indigenous languages with complete fluency, mastering local survival techniques, understanding complex tribal politics, and sometimes taking indigenous wives, creating mixed families that bridged two vastly different worlds. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the Caribbean, France was establishing what would become its colonial crown jewel. Beginning in 1635 with Guadeloupe and Martinique, the real prize came in 1659 when France seized Western Saint-Domingue from Spain. Within decades, this colony transformed into an unprecedented agricultural powerhouse through the brutal exploitation of enslaved African labor. French ships became integral to the triangular slave trade, transporting millions of enslaved Africans to work sugar and coffee plantations under horrific conditions. The economic results were staggering. By the 18th century, Saint-Domingue alone produced 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee. This single Caribbean island became the most profitable European possession in the Americas, generating more wealth than entire mainland empires. The astronomical profits flowed directly to metropolitan France, enriching merchant families in port cities like Nantes, Bordeaux, and Marseille, while funding further colonial expansion. To regulate this brutal system, Louis XIV issued the Code Noir in 1685, defining slavery conditions while providing limited protections that existed alongside provisions treating enslaved people as property. This Caribbean wealth made France a formidable economic rival to Britain's growing commercial empire, setting the stage for future global conflicts that would determine which European power would dominate world trade. In 1664, Finance Minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert established the French East India Company with unprecedented royal backing of 15 million livres, an enormous investment reflecting Louis XIV's determination to challenge Portuguese, Dutch, and British powers dominating Asian trade networks. This massive financial commitment demonstrated France's serious intention to become a global commercial power capable of competing with established maritime empires. French strategy in Asia differed markedly from their increasingly aggressive British rivals. While the British East India Company pursued territorial conquest and direct political control over Indian kingdoms, France emphasized building sophisticated commercial relationships and carefully negotiated diplomatic partnerships with existing local rulers and established merchant communities who controlled regional trade networks. This more subtle diplomatic approach was partly practical necessity. Arriving decades after better established competitors meant finding innovative alternative routes into highly competitive markets. Direct military confrontation with entrenched Dutch trading posts or well-fortified British settlements would have been costly and ultimately futile given France's limited naval resources in distant Asian waters. France's first significant foothold came in 1674, when François Martin established a permanent trading post at Pondicherry, on India's strategically important Coromandel coast. From this modest beginning, Pondicherry grew into the impressive administrative center of French India, featuring distinctive grid-patterned streets and elegant colonial architecture that blended European and Indian influences still visible today. The French systematically expanded their commercial presence, establishing additional comptoirs at strategic locations. Chandanagar in Bengal accessed rich textile markets, where skilled Indian weavers produced fine cotton and silk fabrics highly prized in European markets. Mahe on the Malabar coast connected merchants to the valuable pepper and spice trade that had originally drawn Europeans to Asia. Unlike their brutal Caribbean operations based on enslaved labor, in India the French operated primarily as sophisticated merchants, purchasing finished goods from local producers rather than restructuring economic systems through force. The company traded fine textiles, indigo dyes, saltpeter for gunpowder, exotic spices, and luxury items, including diamonds from the famous Golconda mines. French ambitions extended beyond India to Southeast Asia. In 1680, Pierre Poivre was dispatched to Vietnam, establishing contacts that would evolve into later colonial endeavors. The most dramatic episode occurred in Siam in 1687, when Louis XIV sent over 600 soldiers hoping to secure trade advantages and convert the king to Catholicism. This heavy-handed approach triggered fierce nationalist backlash. The 1688 Siamese Revolution saw anti-foreign factions execute pro-French officials and expel all French forces. This humiliating setback revealed the limits of French influence in Asia and demonstrated that established kingdoms wouldn't simply accept European domination, teaching France that success required subtlety rather than force. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, completed one of history's most consequential explorations. After navigating the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a treacherous journey through thousands of miles of uncharted wilderness, La Salle performed a dramatic ceremony at the Delta that would reshape North American politics forever. Standing on the muddy Gulf shores, surrounded by his exhausted expedition members, La Salle erected a wooden cross and column, buried an engraved plate declaring French sovereignty, and proclaimed possession of Louisiana, a vast territory stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rockies, encompassing nearly 1/3 of the future continental United States. This massive territorial claim represented a strategic masterstroke for French imperial ambitions. By controlling the entire Mississippi watershed, the continent's most important transportation network, France created a devastating geographic vice around British colonies, effectively hemming them along the Atlantic seaboard and preventing westward expansion into the resource-rich interior. Louisiana formed a crucial territorial link between the fur trading economy of northern New France and the profitable Caribbean plantation colonies, theoretically allowing France to create a fully integrated North American empire capable of moving goods, people, and military resources efficiently between different climate zones and complementary economic systems. However, the reality of French settlement fell dramatically short of this grand vision. Unlike densely populated British colonies, where thousands of settlers arrived annually, French Louisiana remained persistently underpopulated. By 1708, more than 2 decades after La Salle's claim, fewer than 300 Europeans lived scattered across isolated trading posts and military forts, separated by hundreds of wilderness miles. This sparse settlement reflected France's different colonial approach. Rather than sending large settler populations to establish agricultural communities requiring massive land clearing and indigenous displacement, French authorities established strategic networks of forts and trading stations designed to maintain territorial claims while developing commercial relationships with powerful indigenous confederations. Indigenous alliances proved absolutely essential for controlling such vast territory with few European inhabitants. Carefully negotiated agreements with the Choctaw, Natchez, Illinois, and other nations secured crucial trade routes and provided vital military support against British and Spanish threats. However, these relationships remained fragile, occasionally erupting into violence, like the devastating 1729 Natchez Revolt that temporarily devastated French settlements. Louisiana's economy initially focused on fur trade. Deerskins and beaver pelts shipped to European markets. French authorities attempted diversification through experimental tobacco, indigo, and sugar plantations, though these struggled compared to Caribbean counterparts due to harsh conditions including floods, tropical diseases, and Gulf Coast hurricanes. The 1713 Treaty of Utrecht dealt a severe blow to French ambitions, forcing surrender of Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Acadia to Britain. These losses critically weakened New France's defenses and heightened Louisiana's strategic importance as a buffer against British expansion. By 1799, a decade of revolutionary upheaval and political chaos had completely exhausted France, creating a dangerous power vacuum that would be filled by one of history's most ambitious military commanders. Napoleon Bonaparte, already celebrated for his brilliant Italian victories, seized control through a precisely executed coup d'état on November 9th and 10th, 1799, forever changing world history. Born in Corsica just 1 year after French annexation, Napoleon's exceptional military education and undeniable tactical genius propelled him rapidly through revolutionary ranks when traditional aristocratic hierarchies had been shattered. By 1798, seeking to strike at British interests while building his reputation, Napoleon led an ambitious Egyptian expedition that, while militarily unsuccessful, produced tremendous scientific achievements, including discovery of the Rosetta Stone. As first consul and later emperor, Napoleon moved with characteristic efficiency to rebuild France through comprehensive reforms. His administrative system created centralized government with appointed prefects ensuring direct imperial control, while the revolutionary Napoleonic Code standardized French law, enshrining principles like equality before the law while maintaining patriarchal family authority. This influential legal framework would spread worldwide, influencing legal systems across Europe and the Americas. However, Napoleon faced enormous colonial challenges that would reshape France's global empire. In Saint-Domingue, enslaved people under Toussaint Louverture had launched their own freedom struggle, seizing revolutionary promises of equality. Napoleon, determined to restore the profitable plantation system and re-establish slavery, dispatched over 20,000 elite troops under General Leclerc to reconquer the rebellious colony through overwhelming force. The combination of tropical diseases devastating European troops and determined resistance from people fighting for fundamental freedom completely defeated this massive expedition, marking one of Napoleon's most significant defeats. This catastrophic failure directly influenced his next major colonial decision with profound global consequences. In 1803, recognizing he couldn't maintain distant American territories while fighting European wars, Napoleon made the pragmatic decision to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for 60 million francs. This remarkable transaction doubled America's size while providing Napoleon with funds for European campaigns. Jefferson's negotiators, originally sent to purchase only New Orleans, were astounded when offered the entire territory spanning from the Mississippi to the Rockies. Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade against British trade, required European compliance, pushing him to extend French control across coastlines. However, this strategy ultimately failed, contributing to his disastrous 1812 Russian campaign, where over 600,000 soldiers marched into Russia, but fewer than 100,000 returned alive. The catastrophic Moscow retreat led to coalition warfare against France. After defeats across Germany, Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814. His dramatic return during the 100 Days ended permanently at Waterloo in 1815, where Prussian reinforcements sealed his fate and ended French European dominance. 31 years after Napoleon's death, his nephew Louis Napoleon Bonaparte accomplished the seemingly impossible, resurrecting the French Empire from Republican ashes. After winning the 1848 presidential election with an overwhelming 74% mandate, he executed a calculated coup on December 2, 1851, and proclaimed the Second Empire in 1852, becoming Emperor Napoleon III in honor of both his uncle and the briefly recognized Napoleon II. This swift transition from republic to empire demonstrated the enduring Bonaparte appeal and French willingness to exchange democratic principles for promises of stability and restored national greatness. Unlike his militarily obsessed uncle, who focused on European conquest, Napoleon III emphasized economic development and urban modernization as foundations for imperial power. He launched unprecedented reconstruction of Paris under Baron Haussmann, replacing medieval neighborhoods with wide boulevards, elegant parks, and modern infrastructure, including gas lighting and improved sanitation. These grand avenues served multiple purposes, improving public health, showcasing imperial splendor, and allowing rapid troop movement to suppress potential rebellions. Lessons learned from previous revolutionary upheavals. Napoleon III enthusiastically embraced industrial development, dramatically expanding railway networks connecting remote regions to major markets, establishing banks, providing essential factory financing, and encouraging technological innovation that transformed France into a modern industrial power capable of competing with British manufacturing supremacy. In colonial affairs, he pursued a peaceful empire strategy, emphasizing economic investment and diplomatic relationships rather than immediate military conquest. He consolidated control in Algeria, transforming it into a model colony with extensive infrastructure development and organized settler immigration, while expanding French influence throughout West Africa, particularly in Senegal and coastal regions. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, provided the perfect opportunity to restore French prestige as a major European power. When Russia invaded Ottoman territories, Napoleon III brilliantly allied with Britain, France's traditional enemy, marking a revolutionary diplomatic shift. French forces proved decisive at Sevastopol, where superior engineering and artillery restored French military reputation after decades of post-Waterloo humiliation. However, Napoleon III's most catastrophic gamble occurred in Mexico, where France attempted something unprecedented since American independence, establishing a European monarchy in the Western Hemisphere, directly challenging the Monroe Doctrine. Beginning in 1861 as debt collection, the venture revealed imperial ambitions to create a French-aligned empire under Archduke Maximilian of Austria. The Mexican adventure became a complete disaster. Republican forces under Benito Juárez maintained fierce resistance, while the American Civil War's end in 1865 allowed U.S. focus on foreign affairs. American opposition, combined with costs exceeding 50 million francs annually, forced French withdrawal. Maximilian's 1867 execution symbolized the venture's total failure and foreshadowed greater disasters ahead. The Second Empire ended through Prussian manipulation when Bismarck edited a diplomatic telegram to suggest insult, provoking Napoleon III to declare war in 1870. A catastrophic miscalculation. From the humiliating Franco-Prussian war defeat and loss of Alsace-Lorraine to the German Empire, France desperately sought new frontiers to restore wounded national pride and re-establish its position as a major global power. The period 1880 to 1910 witnessed the scramble for Africa, an unprecedented European land grab that transformed African political control from 90% indigenous rule to scattered resistance pockets within 3 decades. France emerged as the most aggressive participant, systematically expanding across Africa to create a massive domain stretching from Mediterranean shores to Congo Basin jungles, Atlantic waves to Red Sea trade routes. This enormous empire encompassed diverse climates, hundreds of cultures, and varied economic opportunities that would make France the world's second-largest colonial power after Britain. Algeria's conquest, begun in 1830, intensified dramatically during this expansion period. The systematic brutality was staggering. Historians estimate between 500,000 and 1 million Algerian deaths through warfare, deliberate massacres, introduced diseases, and artificially created famines designed to break resistance and force submission to French authority. Beyond Algeria's blood-soaked territories, French expansion accelerated rapidly. Tunisia became a protectorate in 1881, frustrating Italian ambitions for the strategically important North African nation. Throughout the 1880s to 1890s, France seized vast West African territories, including modern Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Ivory Coast through combinations of military conquest, diplomatic manipulation, and economic coercion. Central African conquests included Gabon, Congo-Brazzaville, and the Central African Republic, often encountering fierce resistance from powerful kingdoms and organized confederations. Madagascar fell in 1896 after brutal campaigns resulting in royal family exile and direct French administrative control. Imperial competition occasionally triggered dangerous confrontations with other European powers. The 1898 Fashoda incident nearly caused war when French and British expeditions met in the Upper Nile region. France's withdrawal acknowledged British regional dominance while highlighting the explosive potential of imperial rivalry. By the late 19th century, France had built the second-largest empire in history. controlling 8.6% of the world's land surface. Their conquest methods were ruthless, overwhelming military force combined with divide-and-conquer strategies that exploited existing ethnic tensions. While many African kingdoms fought bravely for independence, they ultimately fell to superior European weaponry and organization. The French drew arbitrary borders across Africa, ignoring ethnic groups and traditional kingdoms, borders that still fuel conflicts today. In their African territories, France implemented systematic assimilation policies, attempting to transform colonial populations into French citizens through imposed education, law, and culture. Meanwhile, their empire expanded into Southeast Asia, where Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos became French Indochina by 1887. But beneath these impressive achievements lay brutal realities: forced labor, crushing taxation, violent suppression of resistance, and systematic cultural destruction. While France profited, colonial populations suffered. These seeds of discontent would eventually grow into powerful independence movements across 3 continents. World War I forced France to rely heavily on its vast empire for survival. Approximately 600,000 colonial troops served in European trenches, including 275,000 North Africans and 190,000 West Africans. 220,000 colonial workers replaced French laborers in factories, mines, and fields. The legendary tirailleurs sénégalais faced the worst conditions as expendable shock troops in battles like Verdun and the Somme, suffering casualty rates exceeding 25%. French military planners, motivated by strategic necessity and racial prejudices, deliberately deployed these units in the most dangerous frontline positions. This massive exposure to European warfare shattered myths of Western superiority. Despite enormous colonial sacrifices, France maintained imperial control through carefully constructed propaganda. The 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition showcased romanticized colonial cultures while masking growing unrest and independence movements across the empire. Colonial veterans returned expecting recognition and rewards for their wartime service, but found continued discrimination and second-class treatment, planting powerful seeds of independence movements. The interwar period saw organized resistance emerge across French territories. Algeria's Étoile Nord-Africaine, 1926, boldly demanded complete independence. Vietnam saw the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, 1927, and Ho Chi Minh's Indochinese Communist Party, 1930. While the Great Depression's economic hardship fueled colonial unrest as resources continued flowing to metropolitan France, France's stunning 1940 collapse completely shattered illusions of European invincibility across colonial territories. German tanks rolling through Paris in just 6 weeks raised fundamental questions about how colonial subjects could continue respecting and fearing a power that surrendered so quickly to foreign invasion. The empire immediately fractured between competing loyalties: Vichy regime control over much of North and West Africa versus de Gaulle's Free French Resistance based in London. Japan's aggressive expansion in Asia created additional complications, culminating in March 1945 when Japanese forces executed a lightning coup in Indochina, disarming French garrisons and creating the power vacuum Ho Chi Minh's independence movement exploited to organize for complete liberation. When World War II ended in 1945, colonial subjects across the empire expected meaningful recognition and substantial rewards for their enormous sacrifices during both world wars. Instead, they discovered France's absolute determination to reassert complete imperial control while offering only minimal cosmetic reforms, a fundamental disconnect between expectations and reality that would fuel the brutal decolonization conflicts ahead. While France celebrated Allied victory in 1945, colonial subjects who had sacrificed enormously during 2 world wars expected meaningful rewards and recognition. Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence in 1945, using language directly inspired by America's Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and happiness. France deployed modern weaponry and professional soldiers, while Viet Minh forces started with obsolete weapons and improvised explosives. What Vietnamese revolutionaries lacked in military hardware, they compensated for with superior terrain knowledge and brilliant guerrilla tactics. French forces controlled major cities during daylight hours, while Vietnamese fighters ruled the countryside at night, gradually wearing down colonial resolve through constant ambushes and sabotage. By 1950, Cold War dynamics transformed the conflict when Communist China began providing modern weapons and strategic training to Viet Minh forces. The climax came at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where French commanders made a catastrophic miscalculation. They established a heavily fortified base, hoping to draw Vietnamese forces into conventional battle. The strategy proved disastrously wrong when General Vo Nguyen Giap surrounded French positions with artillery pieces that military intelligence believed couldn't possibly be transported through mountainous jungle terrain. More than 10,000 Vietnamese porters had manually hauled heavy guns piece by piece across seemingly impossible terrain, assembling them in positions overlooking the trapped French garrison. After 56 days of devastating bombardment, the fortress surrendered with over 10,000 French soldiers marching into captivity, a humiliating defeat that shocked the world and demonstrated that European colonial powers could be decisively beaten by Asian independence movements. The exact same year, France surrendered at Dien Bien Phu. A new and even more traumatic crisis erupted much closer to home in Algeria. On November 1, 1954, the National Liberation Front launched coordinated attacks across Algeria, beginning what would become France's most traumatic and brutal decolonization struggle that would nearly tear the nation apart. Algeria represented something fundamentally different from other French colonies. After 132 years of French rule and integration, it was legally considered an integral part of metropolitan France itself, divided into 3 French departments with representation in the National Assembly. Over 1 million European settlers had built lives there across multiple generations, viewing Algeria as their only true homeland, worth defending to the death. The conflict rapidly escalated into extraordinary brutality on both sides that shocked international observers. The FLN employed ruthless guerrilla tactics, bombing public spaces frequented by Europeans while systematically targeting Muslim Algerians they considered collaborators with colonial authorities. French military response proved equally harsh, deploying massive force and controversial counterinsurgency techniques, including widespread torture, disappearances, and summary executions that violated international law. Between 1954 and 1962, approximately 300,000 Algerians and 25,000 French people died in fighting that devastated the country and traumatized both societies for generations. By 1958, the Algerian conflict had completely destabilized France itself, collapsing the Fourth Republic amid fears of military coup and civil war. Charles de Gaulle returned to power promising to resolve the crisis while initially maintaining ambiguous positions about Algeria's future. With Algeria's hard-won independence in 1962, France's centuries-long global empire finally ended. The nation that had once controlled vast territories across 5 continents now retained only scattered overseas departments and territories. In bitter historical irony, many successful independence movements were directly inspired by the very ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that had shaped France's own revolutionary heritage, turning French principles against French colonialism itself.